Welcome, everyone, to the CDO Magazine series of one-on-one interviews with CDOs, data leaders, and key influencers. I'm your host, Robert Ludden, Vice President, Santal Consultants. And I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, working with the CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ Symposium, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers. Today, I'd like to introduce Luke Weidner, Chief Technology Officer at Kleo. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you for having me, Robert. I'm really excited to be here.
It is our pleasure. And as I usually do, I'd like to start with a couple of background questions to get our audience a little bit more familiar with you and your background. Now, I noticed that you are still a little bit young, but I believe you had quite an interesting journey so far. And that's why we wanted to interview you. I believe our listeners would be interested if you could explain your experiences so far coming up to this point in your career.
Yeah, so I've always kind of had an interest in going out and doing things on my own. So when I was 11, I started doing kind of these little mobile game applications. I always played mobile games on my phone, and I wanted to make these on my own. So I originally started doing in game studios, and eventually moved on to doing vanilla Java games. And I wanted to put these on the App Store. So to do that, it requires an Apple developer's license, and that's $100 a year. And my 11-year-old self couldn't afford that. So that year, I asked for an Apple developer's license for Christmas, and thankfully Santa Claus came through that year, and I was able to get that. And so going on that year, the rest of the year, I was able to put 9 apps on the App Store. They were just little mini games and things like that. Not very popular in general, but my friends liked playing them, things like that. And it was a great learning experience to try to get my career started. And eventually I moved on to kind of doing freelance projects, things like a real estate app I did, Renter, that kind of helps tenants and owners communicate and store legal documents and things like that. And then my junior year of high school, I moved on to a project called Crowd Clips, which I eventually formed into an LLC. And if you know fan cam or kiss cam or anything like that at a stadium or sporting event, it's a lot like that, where fans will record the app record the video on the app in their phone, and that's automatically submitted to the stadium. So now the stadium doesn't have to rely on the few cameras that are kind of positioned around, and sometimes randomly selecting these disinterested fans. But they can rather find the quote unquote best videos based on some Crowd Clips analytics there that will go through an AI engine and find the best videos based on several factors like the emotion in the faces of fans and movement in the video and things like that. So after I did Crowd Clips for a little while, I started Kleo the summer going into my senior year. The company was originally working with an offshore development firm. But there was a little bit of a barrier to creativity and rapid engineering with the communication there. So when I started on at Kleo, I was excited to bring that aspect, and I've been there ever since.
Certainly, I want to get into more of the Crowd Clip application. But first of all, for our listeners, it would be worthwhile to understand a little bit more about what Kleo does. So can you give us some background on what Kleo does?
Yeah, so Kleo is a revolutionary language learning program. I think it's going to be amazing. It's wildly different from what other people are doing in the language learning space. We're working on patent pending technology to give a kind of conversational style of learning. It puts the speaking, the context, and all instant feedback in a form that will change not only the nature of language learning, but I think the nature of learning in general. We hope to launch with Spanish, German, and Italian soon this year. And we spend a lot of time focusing on algorithms to keep people engaged and measure their proficiency in things like words that are spoken in the language and even skills that they can use in this language. And we've grown and brought on more developers, and we're doing great now and hoping to go forward towards launch soon.
So I understand from your background and reading up that you have a particular specialty, and this specialty is on solving a company's most complex problems. I'm wondering if you could elaborate and perhaps give an example of this approach.
Yeah, so whenever I'm faced with a problem, especially a complex problem, I have a kind of structured way that I go about it. And it really boils down to breaking down the problem into its most simple roots and kind of explaining it like you would to a kid or someone who really doesn't know much about the industry you're working in. As a kid, I always used to ask these questions, why don't they just do this? Why don't they just do that? Why don't they just put wheels on a house and move it? And a lot of times I would find out why they don't just do this. But that gets you to learn. And a lot of times when you take this process, you find a solution that keeps your technical ideas at the back of mind, right? Your ideas of preconceived notions of how something should be done, how it's traditionally done. It's not always the best way to get it done. A lot of times it is, but a lot of times for a complex problem, there's solutions that are out there that are better, simpler, more efficient. And when you're boiling it down to the most simple roots, I find that it mostly comes down to 2 or 3 big points of decision that can affect the solution the most. Once you boil it down to these 2 or 3 points, I think it all becomes about task management and making the little decisions. And for each little decision, then it becomes easier and easier. You just repeat the process, answer it like you would a kid, break it down into its most simple roots. One example of this would be, let's say, like quick communication, the problem of quick communication in like the 1870s, right? They had this mailing system before the invention of phones, right? And they could have spent years and years and years on finding faster ways to travel, faster ways to deliver mail, more efficient ways of delivering the whole system. But instead, someone asked, why don't they just send the message in its most raw form through like an electrical signal, right? And they're then forced with smaller problems. How do you send this message? How do you receive it? How do you translate it? And on each of these, you just repeat the process, the same simple breakdown, ask like a kid, ask, why don't they just do this? Why don't they just do that? And that's really, I think, my approach to how I go about solving any problem that comes to me.